Morning all. How's my sound? Good, hopefully. Oh, the chat's not working. Hang on. Do. There we go. And we want live chat, not top chat. That way I won't miss anything. Good. There we all are. Oh, how are you all? It's been a week. Housekeeping. Right. Reminder, this is not my main channel and I'm trying to grow it. Probably not many of you are watching it right now, but if you're watching it later, please do share the link to this channel. It's my live streaming channel. This is where interviews and shows like this and occasional other shows and so on will be when something particularly exciting and stream worthy is happening in the world, or if I decide to run any more online games or anything, which I keep intending to do, but somehow never quite feel up to it. Don't know why. How's the cat? That's probably why people are watching. If they're watching, he's okay. He's got another 3 weeks in the crate. He's hobbling around, putting a little bit of weight on the paw, which I kind of wish he wouldn't. But yeah, we've got to keep him crated up fully for another 3 weeks. Then he can come out for a bit, for another couple of weeks after he's been taken in, had another x-ray and so on. The main problem, I think, is boredom. I'm trying to sit in there with him while I'm working on my laptop and stuff. The little cat is keeping him company. Nick is keeping him company, which is quite sweet, because normally he's just around me the whole time, but he's spending a lot of time in there with his big bro. So we've got enough money for the time being. Thank you for people still offering work and help and so on. It's just something about animals that gets to people, isn't there? What else? Because of the problems with the cat's health, I got about a week behind on Schlocktoberfest. So rather than not do everything I was planning for Schlocktoberfest, it's going to spread over slightly into November to explain all that. I did put out a collection of 5 200-word RPGs to go towards him. But like I say, we've got enough money now, so any excess I'll give to some kind of charity, probably a pet's charity, a no-kill shelter, and put some of it towards the Dark Souls Scholarship. It's not going to be quite as much as I would like, because obviously he's got to go in for another x-ray, and there's medicine costs, and he only takes his medicine if you put it on tuna. So, you know, things mount up, and taking care of pets is expensive, but it's worth it. What else? A while ago, I hired a bunch of people to write adventures for Gore. All except one dropped out, and they're being very slow, but that's fine because I know the quality will be good. And just found someone else who's really heavily into the whole thing, understands it as well as I do. A lifelong fan. They've written the bare bones of an adventure, so I need to go back to them and get that sorted out. But hopefully I can take them on to do more work, because I can't produce the content all by myself. Is anything else going on? Picked up an easel, so I hope to be doing some art, some painting again, which I haven't in years. Maybe I'll show you, maybe I won't. We shall see. Just give it a minute for anyone else extra to show up. As usual, I'll deal with any comments or anything at the end. Brexit stuff I'll leave towards the end too. So that's about it. You can ask me questions about anything you want, really. It doesn't have to be related to the news or business or whatever. I'll get to them at the end. Okay, looking presentable. This is how you know it's a morning show. And you know the shtick of it. I've just looked at the headlines. Don't know what I'm talking about, like most YouTube commentators. Part satire, part genuine news show. And I'm very, very tired and crotchety and grumpy. Just Brexit. And the heating's been on, and that always disrupts my sleep for a while. Until I get used to it. Right, let's dive in. Alright, very British news. Prince Harry and the Duke of Sussex, his Madge, well, not quite, but you know, and his Mrs. Meghan Markle have been under intense scrutiny by the tabloid press. Now, you would think that after what happened with Diana, they might back off a bit, and given what happened with Diana, in particular, they might lay off Harry and William and their families, but of course they haven't, and they don't. And I'm certainly no royalist. I'm a small R Republican. Family ancestry is Roundheads, you know, the ones who protected Parliament against the excesses of a papist monarch and lopped off his head. So it's in the blood to not like the family. But I do think the excesses of the gutter press are something we should all be concerned about. I mean, they were hacking dead girls' phones and things not too many years ago, if you remember. And while I'm all for a strong free press, a lot of this seems like excess. So in this one, weirdly, I'm kind of on the side of the royalists. A, because I don't like the intrusive nature of the press as it has become. B, because it's just distasteful. C, because they use these tactics against all of us. And D, I just don't like the gutter press any more than I like the overly woke press. So I think it's understandable, given what happened to Diana, how her mental health was affected by being dogged by paparazzi, how she was essentially killed in part by being pursued by paparazzi. I think it's understandable why William and Harry would be so kind of anti-press, at least that quarter of the press. And it maybe shows the kind of direction that the royal family is going to go into in the future. William has said similar things, though in a more muted way, because he's actually in line for the throne. Harry is freer to speak. A lot of the press actually likes them. I find them a distraction. I find them pointless. I don't find them newsworthy for the most part. But these intrusive actions that we wouldn't accept against anyone else, why should we let it go here? Why should we let them write massive, nasty, untrue hit pieces about people? Why should we allow them to telephoto lens them while they're on their own, private property, up to nothing that's particularly bad or anything? It's none of this is good. And there's an aspect to equality that I think a lot of people don't understand. It's about treating everybody the same way, right? And I want my privacy as a private citizen respected and understood and looked after, right? Which means I must therefore want the same for them. I do think there are exceptions where things are in the public interest. Maybe an actual monarch is a subject of public interest because they do have some tiny minor political effect and influence. But otherwise, celebrities, no. Politicians, maybe. We want to know if they're on the take or whatever else. But this is essentially just a posh, rich family. All right? And unless they're doing something that is genuinely in the public interest, I do not give a single solitary fuck. But that's an aspect of equality that I think a lot of people don't understand. It means treating everybody as equal before the law, giving everybody the same privacy and protections for the most part. There's always going to be some exceptions that you can actually argue. And so that means treating the genuinely privileged, such as the royal family, in the same way that I would want to be treated, right? That's an aspect to equality that a lot of people don't understand, and a lot of social justice warrior types don't understand. Maybe I'll go off on a rant about that at the end. I don't know. There's protests in Chile, or however you want to pronounce it. First, I've actually heard of it, which I feel bad about, but I haven't been keeping up on the news, particularly the international news, as much as I would like, due to Brexit kind of dominating my concerns. People like to go on about the French protests and others, but there's a lot of this shit going on all over the world. We're either seeing a shift to right-wing populism, or we're seeing mob violence, mass protests about all kinds of issues. In Chile, what is it actually about? Okay. If you're a Londoner, you'll understand this one. The rioting and unrest was sparked by what was going to be a hike in the fare for the metro system in Santiago, and that's been suspended. So the hike in price isn't going to happen for the time being. But the riots and unrest have continued, and they've become about a bigger problem around living costs and inequality in Chile. This should sound oddly familiar, right? Because the French protests started out over a hike in fuel prices, which is meant to be an environmental measure, which still would have been a lot less than we pay here in the UK, incidentally. And that sparked a massive protest, which has slowly shifted to the right and become more violent and lost its way in the way a lot of these protests do. As I think we're seeing unfold with Extinction Rebellion. This is the problem of factionalism and exploitation, people taking advantage, people riding the coattails of protests. I think we're seeing that with Extinction Rebellion in exactly the same way as we did with Occupy, and these things work much better when they stick to a single issue. I think we're also seeing that in Hong Kong to a lesser extent. They seem more unified around what they actually want, and it does directly link to what sparked the initial protest. Activists and so on being shipped off and black-bagged to the Chinese mainland out of Hong Kong is what sparked that original protest, and now it's become a broader demand for democracy. But you can see the thread there much more clearly from one issue to the next, to the greater issue of democracy and the fact that Hong Kong has been infected with Western ideas. But this and the French protests and so on, which are still ongoing, it's less easy to see quite the connection there. But it's all driven by the same forces, primarily economic ones, and sort of balancing the public interest against the interest of the planet and the interests of business. And so it's a constant game. Something's going to give soon on a global scale. I can kind of sense it coming. Hopefully it'll be a managed snap, which is what the British have traditionally been good at, but not lately. But we're probably looking at another Great Recession before too long. And you look at all the forces that were unleashed by the previous one globally, and this does not bode well for our heroes. So if anyone wants to kidnap me and take me to Scandinavia, as you used to, because you used to be Vikings, I'm ready, I'm willing, come get me. I want to get out of this chicken shit outfit. But what happened to actually make the international news was that 5 people have died in Chile after a garment factory was set on fire by looters near Chile's capital, Santiago. And the military and police, who've already been deployed because a state of emergency has been declared, have been using tear gas and water cannon against protesters. And a curfew has been imposed on major cities, which people seem to be ignoring. Santiago already has a state of emergency, which is probably why the military are out. And that's now being extended to other cities. So we're starting to see some genuinely horrible problems in South America. Here's hoping it stays contained, but this is the kind of thing that leads to popular, either democratic or non-democratic revolts, as happened in Venezuela. And then outside forces tend to overreact, and then the forces inside get paranoid and controlling, and then it all goes wrong. So, fingers crossed for Chile and South America as a whole. On to the next story. So this is about scams. I've been kind of switched on to scams lately, or at least the psychology of scams, because I think it reveals a lot. Some of you aren't going to like this, but it reveals a lot about Brexit and the psychology around Brexit and why people's attitudes have hardened in the pro-Brexit camp, even though I think it's unquestionable at this point that they were lied to, they were scammed, they were cheated, but they just keep doubling down and getting more extreme. And I often go out on about this in videos about a lot of things, but there is a psychological sort of tick in the human brain that we don't like to admit that we've been scammed, and we will argue to defend the people who have scammed us because we kind of don't want to admit weakness or failure. And this happens politically, economically, you name it, right? You take someone into your confidence and you invest confidence in them and then they betray you. And there's a big part of us that just wants to deny that because we don't want to show vulnerability. Whether you agree with me on Brexit or not, that's what's got my interest in this psychological effect. And I've been reading things like police reports and articles in psychological journals about this. It's a huge issue for the police who want to investigate scammers, because the people who've been scammed often don't want to testify, won't admit that there's a scam, and it's members of their family who are bringing it up and seeking police assistance, but the person who is being scammed just doesn't want to admit it, and it's a big issue. But there's been a big problem with basically call center scams. So in India, Bangladesh, I can't remember, but there's a whole bunch of other places that do a lot of legitimate call center work, right? Much as people hate to hear an Indian voice on the other end, or a South Asian voice of any kind on the other end, it is a cost-effective way to outsource these things. No job is safe. And there's also increasing automation, for which you can blame my wife in part, because she works on the kind of automated voice over IP services. Those things you get lost in. Press 1 to continue, press 2 for the company she works for does a lot of that. But a lot of organized scams are set up using essentially call centers and trying to defraud people out of money. You may have got calls, hello, this is... They often use Western names, even though their accent is so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. Right, so this is Peter. I'm calling about your computer. I'm not being racist. The accent is that thick. Worse, I can't do the level of accent that you often get. Trying to tell you there's something wrong with your computer and they need to get access to it and they can fix it, pretending to be there from Windows or Microsoft or Apple or whoever else. Phone companies. I've had someone claiming to be from Vodafone wanting to get into my Android. So you got to be careful with this. These kind of people are never going to call you up. You're going to have to solicit them, right? But you also need to be careful if you're looking for tech support and you run a Google search. Quite often you'll get results that are these scam centers. So you're actually calling a scammer and saying, essentially, please rip all my data out of my computer, steal my bank details and rip me off for thousands of pounds because I can't get Word to open. Be careful. Go to legitimate people, or start by going to friends who are computer literate. None of you are going to thank me for saying that if you are computer literate, but they will know their way around these kind of things. And it happens with pop-up ads, it happens with cold calling, it happens with bogus adverts for things when you search for help with your computer. They've got a case file on the BBC, which is there's not really a lot of detail, but this was a pop-up ad that was offering him computer security protection for 12 years for £556. He signed up and was charged £4,000, and they basically had it away on their toes with his money. Hopefully his bank was sympathetic. International police work on these things, but international cooperation can be difficult. And there's been big international operations to do this. This case that they're highlighting, it was British and Indian police working with Microsoft to find who was doing this, and they shut it all down. But it happens all the time. I get 3, 4, 5 calls a year, and I'm ex-directory. It happens. If you've got relatives with a computer who aren't computer literate, drum these things into their head, write it down on a post-it, stick it near to their computer. Just have them be alert and aware of scams. I mean, if you see a pop-up message like this, if you get a cold call like this, treat it the same way as if a bunch of crusty travellers had turned up at your door offering to re-tarmac your drive, right? Put it in terms that they can understand. I find that's a good way of getting through to people. And make sure that you've got protection on the accounts that you use to pay for anything that you do online to look after you. All right? Internet Dad signing out. Sticking with tech news. A lot of us are basically never off the clock at this point. For me, it's voluntary because I run my own business, okay? Which means I never really get a break. I'm kind of okay with that. I don't know what to do with myself if I'm not busy. Even though my illness makes it hard to work as constantly and consistently as I would like. But even people who don't work for themselves often feel like they're never off the clock anymore because you're constantly getting work email, right? And you're expected to have access to your work email wherever you go, on your phone, on your laptop, notebook, tablet, wherever else, right? You're usually generally expected to be responsive to stuff going on at work. You might be on call, you might not, right? But you don't get paid for this to be bugged. Right, if you're on call, you get a certain amount of compensation or overtime, unless it's baked into your contract. But for the rest of us, there is often a constant slow bombardment of work email throughout the evenings and the weekends, throughout your holidays and so on. And we feel compelled to check our email, right? Social media more these days, but a lot of work stuff is now coming through special work chat systems and so on. But it's always there. Now, there has been a push for a few years to try and suggest that maybe we would all be better off if we didn't have this going on, if work wasn't constantly bombarding us with email and so on. And so quite a few companies have adopted a new code of practice, basically, where if you're not in the office, you don't get the email. Versus one way or another. They basically have blackouts. France has even put laws in place that basically enforce this, that you cannot be harassed out of hours unless you're being compensated for it. But they've just done a fairly reasonable study at the University of Sussex. It's not watertight, it's not really big enough. We need more studies. But what this suggests is that not having access to your work email causes more stress than it alleviates. Maybe that would change over time, so we need a long-term study or whatever. But it seems that by not having access to work email, by not being able to respond to stuff, we have a level of anxiety about what's going on with the business, what's going on with our jobs, what's going on with the work, that we don't cope particularly well with. So, something to consider. I know before social media, people used to get email anxiety, right? I just have to check my email. Even when you used to have to dial in, I would dial in pretty much on the hour while I was awake back when it was dial-up to get my email. Fair enough, I was quite busy on LARP Society email lists at the time for storytellers, rules makers, players, everything really. So I feel that my email paranoia was a bit more justified because I wanted to be involved in these ongoing discussions that were going on. But I think we all feel that to an extent. So I would think this would get better over time if you stop expecting to be able to check, and if there was still emergency means of contact like text message or whatever, that would be fine. But basically, we're still adjusting to all this. This is the biggest upheaval in human cooperation and communication since the printing press, which caused, all manner of issues. We got used to that. And a lot of what people worry about with the internet is scaremongering and nonsense, and we'll adapt again. We'll find new etiquette, we'll find new practices, we'll come to a happy medium at some point. And I would look to the younger kids today who haven't known anything other than the internet. So basically, anyone born since 1995, maybe. So sort of teens and 20s people. That's basically when I feel that the internet became ubiquitous. Maybe since 2000 to make it a little bit neater. But yeah, look at those people and how they cope with the internet. What practices they have, what they do, to see maybe the future of how we cope. Also, there's going to be more and more legislation and so on. It's going to be unstoppable at some point. It's unfortunate because we're going to lose a lot of what made the internet such a disruptive and useful technology in the first place, but we're going to find that same kind of happy medium eventually that we did with the printed word. I think maybe that's weirdly optimistic of me, but yeah, that's what I think. Take it for whatever value you find in it. But there's some studies that do suggest that this is going to make people more stressed. And kind of following on from that, there's a secondary story about gadget etiquette and things. Are we spending too much time on our phones? Should we let our guests know if we have those smart speakers that are listening in and so on? Internet of Things. How much should we wipe off our phones before we give them as hand-me-downs to our kids, or whatever else? This kind of bleeds over from what I was saying. We need to get to a point where we understand what we're doing and how we cope with this stuff. So there's my phone, lovely picture of Satine's gob on it. And I'm on it a lot. I find myself using it more and more and more over time. I didn't used to. I didn't like mobile phones. I didn't get one for ages. Basically, almost until there were smartphones. Smartphones, I see a point in and I get something out of because I can use it as a music player. I can record video and audio. I can keep notes. The fitness tracker, everything. It's much more of a portable computer now. And I tend to use it more as a kind of tablet than a phone. But I really resented mobile phones because I liked to be left the fuck alone quite often. And it isn't really until they became smartphones and cameras that I became a convert, because that has more use. But what is the etiquette, right? How do we find that? Do we need an etiquette? You can't impose one, really. You might decide in your household that, you eat with a knife and fork, you sit up at the table, you keep your elbows off, and your phone is off. You might decide that, but society as a whole, etiquette comes about as a kind of mutual hallucination or agreement on an unwritten social contract and rules. I don't think it's something you can just impose on society by thinking about it and saying this is what we should do. I think we'll find our norms naturally. This is also what I think about language. I don't think it's useful or a good idea necessarily to try and impose linguistic changes upon society. People don't seem to understand me when I make this point, but PC language is an attempt to impose a particular mode of speaking, a particular meaning, definitions and redefinitions onto others. That hardly ever works unless it's backed up by force, which is what I feel that cancel culture and other similar things are. And even then, it just breeds resentment. Whereas if you allow language to change over time, people to make the choice to speak in certain ways, that's much healthier and much more effective. And that's how language changes. I acknowledge that language changes, though I bemoan it in some cases. What I don't accept is the attempt to impose language. And similarly, I don't think attempts to impose a particular kind of phone or gadget etiquette is going to work. This is something that is going to evolve and develop over time. But of course, technology changes so rapidly that our social systems, let alone our biology, don't really have time to adapt. So maybe I'm wrong, right? Because we won't have time to get used to the current technosocial paradigm before it changes. And maybe we won't be able to adapt to the internet because the next big thing will be along much quicker as things accelerate and the singularity takes off. There's a lot of tech news today. Zuckerberg gave a big speech to students at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Lots of tidbits. I don't believe the kind of things that he was saying about free speech. I don't think he's a free expression advocate at all. I don't think he ever has been. Twitter, they're hypocrites about it, but at least they're hypocrites because they initially had quite a free speech stand, right, which has been eroded over time. Zuckerberg, I don't think has ever really been pro-free expression, pro-free speech. He's part of that Silicon Valley bubble, but he's not part of that older school, slightly hippie-ish, more libertarian side, right? He's something different, and I think he was so young when he hit it big that he's kind of been insulated from the world a lot, and I think that's part of the reason he is so awkward and robotic, is because he had such rapid success so early on, albeit at the expense of others, and that has kind of divorced him from reality. I almost feel sorry for him in some ways, weirdly. Too much empathy. But as we head into the end game, one way or the other, of Brexit, and as we stare down the next big election in the United States, and as we stare down a general election here in the UK, of particular concern and interest is Facebook political ads, which he said he's not going to censor politicians, and seems to have moved away from trying to get rid of or to control fake news. So it's kind of selective free speech in a way. And this is a problem that we've been wrestling with here in the UK. Brexit was in no small part pushed over the line in the illegal referendum due to the illegal misuse of data and a massive overspend by the Leave campaign, much of which was spent on targeted private adverts. So this is not stuff that you would see in your general feed necessarily, though some of it might have been, but it was targeted advertising, you know, really drilling down to people who were kind of on the edge from data processing and trying to push them over the edge with stuff that was absolute balderdash, piffle, and nonsense. Now, most advertising is held to a reasonably high standard. They tend to weasel around a lot of it. Like, if you tell them, right, you must put certain nutritional information on your packaging, it'll be on the back where you can't see it. It'll be in tiny type. It'll be under the seam of the plastic, you know, that kind of thing, because they don't want you to see exactly how much fat or salt or, you know, whatever else is in there, because it will influence your purchasing decisions. But even so, advertising is quite heavily regulated. Political advertising isn't. You're essentially allowed to lie, but this is somewhere where a terms of service could actually be a positive, rather than a vague thing used to suppress people's speech. Surely we should hold our politicians to the same kind of standards that we do our advertisers, right? Our advertisers are fucking dodgy in the way that they get around things, and they twist language and they use weird terms and so on. And our politicians aren't even restrained to that degree. So given the role that data abuse and targeted Facebook advertising and illegal spending and so on, that was hard to get at because it was so opaque on Facebook, given the role that has played in perverting our democracies, even if you agree with the end result, right, you should, I think, back the idea that we want clean votes, clean results, things that are unimpeachable, right? We want to win cleanly in the battle of ideas, most of us, I would hope. And so we need to adapt to these issues, which goes back yet again to the idea of tech etiquette and, you know, disruptive technology and so on, and finding this happy medium. But if he's saying, I am willing and able to massively censor people who use my platform, but not politicians, yeah, that's a worry. Maybe it's simply self-preservation because he doesn't want regulation, doesn't want Facebook to be broken up. And if he makes things difficult for politicians, obviously that's going to negatively affect their impression of Facebook. And with the Republicans in the US, particularly, in power at the moment, and so reliant on fake news and bad paradigms and all the rest of it. Even if you agree with their ideas, again, I would think that you would want to win cleanly. But if with them so reliant on flim-flam and nonsense, maybe that's why he's not coming down as hard on that, at the same time that the common user is being come down on really hard for showing a nipple or suggestion of underboob or making off-color jokes or whatever else. And going right back to what I was saying earlier, this is an instance of people not being treated equally and fairly. And we see the same thing on Twitter, right? If Trump was just an ordinary citizen saying some of the things that he said, retweeting some of the things he's retweeted on Twitter, he would have been banned, shadow banned, sanctioned, whatever else, multiple times. He isn't, while us plebeians do get arbitrarily accounts cancelled, soft censored, hard censored all the time. So there's an inequality there. To an extent, you understand, because politicians seeing what they're saying and so on is important. But at the same time, there's an unequal treatment there, which isn't fair. It's a genuine case of privilege, right? Rather than it being a buzzword. Sliding away from tech into science. There's a solar probe called Solo, not Han Solo, just Solo, which is being sent to... It'll be as close to the sun as we've ever gotten, I think. Solar Orbiter, or Sol-O, I guess, is how you was meant to pronounce it. It's a probe that's going to be launched soon. It's built, ready for launch. It's going to be put inside the orbit of Mercury. And will train its telescopes on the surface of the sun, so I hope it's got its shades with it. It's also got magnetometers, particle detectors, all kinds of things. So we're hoping it will give us new, fresh insights into the sun. And after all, we all depend on the sun, which has a kind of 11-year cycle of activity. So we hope to gain some insights into why there's that 11-year cycle, what's going on there, how this all works. To also understand the kind of the eruptions that we get from the sun and the solar flares and so on, which can damage satellites, irradiate our astronauts, screw up radio communications, even knock out power grids. There's a famous massive solar flare from the early 20th century, I think, that knocked out the telegraph. So these big networks basically get hit by these electromagnetic waves, and it causes surges and problems. A lot of our infrastructure is EM proof now, thanks to paranoia about the Cold War and so on, but it can still cause a massive amount of damage. So the more we learn about this, the better, and the more we can understand solar cycles, the better. A lot of people like to blame solar cycles for global warming and so on, and certainly the waxing and waning of solar activity will have an effect on the entire solar system, but it's marginal compared to the greenhouse effect. But this can still help us understand all of that, and when the solar minimum and maximum is, and can help us work around these kind of things. Maybe we can also gain insights into protecting ourselves in orbit from solar flares and so on in a more cost-effective way, and for as and when we start to settle on Mars. So Mars doesn't have a magnetic field. which is a big part of the reason why the atmosphere was stripped off. So any long-term colonization of Mars or terraforming of Mars will need some kind of, well, artificial protection for the surface from these kind of electromagnetic storms and so on. There are crustal plates on Mars that are magnetized and offer a certain small amount of protection, so that's where we want to settle. It's all understanding the sun helps us understand and cope with everything, basically. I'm being slow today, aren't I? Not gone many stories. I guess I'm feeling talkative. I was supposed to go gaming this weekend, but I stayed home to look after the cat, so I haven't been socialised much. There was a all-woman spacewalk, whoop-de-doo, Tarantula Town. I don't really know why this is a story particularly. Women have done spacewalks before. Women aren't that different to men when it comes to this kind of thing. I don't understand why this is significant, why it's a milestone. It's like they're just coming up with things for the sake of it. First man in space, first woman in space, first man to spacewalk, first woman to spacewalk. All of these things, they're significant, right? I suppose, though I tend to view it in human terms. Which isn't to poo-poo it, right? It's an accomplishment. It's one of a long line of accomplishments. But I just find it hard to care and don't see why this is a story, because I see men and women as equal. One thing I could get behind is putting the first woman on the moon, right? Because that would mean we're going back, which I want to. Speaking of, NASA has unveiled a new spacesuit for the next moon landing, and they even put a woman in it. Let me just grab this because it's pretty cool looking, and it's an interesting design. Let me just bring it up for you, which I don't normally do on the channel, but let's see. Image. Browse. Where are you? Downloads. Okay, let's bring this up for you. There we go. Everyone see that? That is pretty cool. Despite the "look at us, we're American" sort of thing going on there. Let me move that down here for you. Okay, so that is the new spacesuit that is intended for use on the moon. So it's I just find the design really interesting. It looks like a throwback to some early sort of science fiction-y designs. It reminds me also more of some of those deep sea suits, the hard suits. And there is a mix of hard and soft elements here, whereas the original Apollo suits were much more soft. It looks a lot more lightweight, it looks a lot more maneuverable, and basically the top half of the body all seems to be one central unit, right? It looks much more robust, lightweight, maneuverable, better visibility, because the glass for the helmet seems to be further back. I think that looks fantastic. I'm glad they're doing it, and this is kind of it's a hopeful thing for humanity's return to the moon, which I think is an important and good thing. It's called XEMU, and this is a prototype. It's kind of similar to the ones currently used on the ISS, but a bit different. NASA says it's got more comfort, fit, mobility, and stability. So this is what the Orion crew will be using. So it gives them a lot more maneuverability in the shoulders. I guess if you look there, you can see how the hard suit part comes in more. Much more flexibility. And back in the Apollo era, when you were in those suits, you couldn't really reach up. But in these ones, I think as you can see, there's much more room to raise your arms. Yeah, any bit of mobility that you can add is fantastic. There's a whole bunch of technical details which I don't think we're as interested in, unless maybe you are. I can come back to the story later. It's just overall, it's a great big leap forward in the technology, but it also clearly draws on what happened with Apollo. Now that's part of what I find so interesting about the more recent sort of manned spaceflight developments is it's gone back to technology we had in the 50s and 60s and just updated it, right? Now, I guess that makes sense, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And the whole shuttle era was basically pause on the space program. And that was change that didn't really work out. It was never as cost effective as we thought. The reusability wasn't as high. There wasn't ongoing development. So kind of hitting reset on Apollo, though I wish they hadn't called it Orion. Orion's meant to be nuclear-powered spacecraft, god damn it. But going back to that and updating it and improving it with modern technology that's cheaper, lighter, more powerful, more effective, all the rest of it, it makes sense, I guess. I'm hoping that private kind of spaceflight has applied a bit of pressure there. Environmental news. Plastic bags. We've basically phased them out for the most part. They're still available if you want them, but you get charged a little bit, and that money gets used for good purposes. We get these forever bags, which we then forget to take with us, which means we spend more on bags. But here's the ultimate irony. The inventor of the plastic shopping bag, Sten Gustaf Thulin, was the guy, apparently. He invented these sort of peelable little plastic bags because they wouldn't use much in the way of materials, and a big plus for him was that he saw it as saving the planet, because it meant less trees being cut down and used for paper bags, right? So his idea was that it would help with forestation. It just kind of goes to show how our perception of things changes. See, the irony is that back when we were using paper bags and paper sacks, like a lot of Americans still are, if that gets thrown away, I mean, it will release some of the carbon as it rots, but it's also sequestering a lot of carbon in the form of paper and wood in landfill and so on. So maybe we should have stuck with paper and cardboard, maybe. One of the most effective ways to sequester carbon would be to grow great big forests of fast-moving trees and then bury them, or drop them down to the bottom of the sea if you can get them to sink. That sort of thing as a way of sequestering carbon. Much more cost-effective, speedier, and more efficient than most of the artificial means we've got of sequestering carbon. But it just goes to show, and that's why I picked this story out, that you can think you're doing the right thing for the environment, but then it was more back then environmentalism was more about preserving countryside and wild spaces and so on than the environment as a whole, climate as we think of it. And it just goes to show how you can make these kind of decisions without really knowing what the knock-on is. We have a much better understanding now, but we can't go expecting it to be perfect. So we always need to be revising and reviewing and looking again and again and again. I think that's something that a lot of people that don't understand science get wrong when they criticize it, because they seem to think that we take it as a dogma rather than considering things changing constantly. Great progress has been made in growing neurons, so brain cells, nerve cells, in vitro. On plates and so on. We can do that with a lot of other tissue, to the point where we can now essentially 3D print new bladders and certain other basic organs, and it's only going to get better over time. Neurons, there's something that it's very hard to fix. There's been some success by basically injecting stem cells into the areas around where someone suffered nerve damage. in kind of the vague hope that the stem cells will turn into nerve cells and stitch things back together. Limited success, very limited. But if we can grow nerve cells and use them to create nerve bridges and so on, that's so much better. There's also semi-organic computers. They've used rat neurons to run little computer devices and chips and so on. It's all very interesting. Human brains are difficult, right? So scientists have been growing mini brains, which are sort of collections of neurons, on plates, in trays, in nutrient solutions and so on, as a way of studying brains without, or at least neurons, without resorting to vivisection or whatever else. So they've grown all kinds of different nerve cells, starting with rats and mice, obviously. These days they're up to chimp cells, macaque cells, and human cells. Something interesting that they've discovered is that of all the primates, human brain cells, human neurons, grow much more slowly and develop much more slowly, which perhaps goes some way to explaining our extremely long childhoods. And the fact that we're basically born before we should, which has a massive effect on our society and everything else. But they've discovered, as I said, that human brain cells appear to develop much more slowly than other ape-like species, other primates. And they're using these small sets of artificially grown ganglia to try and understand how small genetic changes can have an effect on the way in which neurons develop and grow, trying to find out why it takes longer to grow, longer to develop, whether this has some kind of relevance to human consciousness and intelligence and capability and so on. We have a really high brain to body proportion. Why? How much of this is down to this, or how much of it is down to genetics? How much does it all interrelate? It's complicated but fascinating stuff. Things that make us uniquely human. And it all basically comes down to the grey pudding in our noggins. So the more we understand about even the basic building blocks of our grey pudding, the better. Also drilling down to basics, there's a massive Anglo-American effort to try and uncover what the really early signs of cancer are. Right? So they're growing a whole bunch of cells and monitoring them and watching them, taking as many readings as possible, hoping basically that one of these experiments will kind of spontaneously develop cancer, and then by looking back at the data that they've gathered, they can figure out what the warning signs are. And yes, hopefully the idea is that will enable us to anticipate the development of cancer sooner, or to confirm it sooner. And the sooner you know that cancer's there, the sooner you can operate, the less likely it is to spread, and so on. These kind of experiments, the neurological experiments, the cancer experiments, excuse me, and it's kind of crunching a lot of data in a way that we haven't been able to before. We're having a kind of slow revolution in medical technology, and increasingly a shift to early diagnosis, anticipation, because that has a big knock-on effect that saves money and saves lives. It's a win-win, essentially. And that I find that interesting because some of the most cost-effective medical systems in the world, it's one of the few things that authoritarian communism ever got right, was to have clinics and to really concentrate and fixate on preventative care, right? And early diagnosis, that kind of thing. It's why Cuba's doctors are so effective. Yeah, it's one of the very few things that authoritarian pseudo-communist regimes ever got right, was their approach to medicine. And now we're seeing that kind of attitude combining with technology to increase our options for preventative care and early screening and so on. And like I say, that's much more cost effective. It's much cheaper and easier to treat a cancer early in its development, or even before it really has a chance to develop, than it is to carve someone up and put them through years of chemo and so on later on, if the cancer's had time to develop and spread. So, yeah, medical technology takes fucking forever to actually filter through the system and come out, but this is all very hopeful, I think, particularly in terms of cost saving, which is a big concern for places like the NHS. So if we can save money by applying technology for preventative care, it kind of combines the best strings of every single aspect of medicine that humanity currently has. The very left-wing preventative care, universal care paradigm, the private enterprise high technology paradigm, all coming together with technological developments that aren't even necessarily from the medical field. Fascinating stuff. Fat people have fat lungs, it turns out. It may not just be your weight or the compression of your organs that's making you short of breath, but fatty tissue is now being discovered in the lungs of obese people. Australian researchers analysed lung samples from 52 people, small sample size, grain of salt, and found that the amount of fat consistently increased in line with their body mass index. BMI, obviously, it's not the best measure. There's all kinds of other issues around it. But basically, if you're fat, you probably have fat lungs, and that, along with everything else, is going to lead to shortness of breath, increased risk of asthma, increased susceptibility to air pollution, and so on. So basically, yet another reason not to be fat. Not a lot of depth to that story, I just found it interesting. Another medicine technology intersection. Microphones. Very powerful microphones attached to your joints to detect arthritis. Now, if you're like me and getting a bit older, when you get up, your knees often pop, or your hips, or whatever else. It's not arthritis in my case, but for people who might have arthritis, this is a new diagnostic technique. So basically, you detect the sound going on in someone's joints as they stretch and snap and whatever else, and then run that through algorithms that know what arthritis sounds like and get your diagnosis that way. So again, more tech. There's a whole bunch of stuff being done with mobile phones and ultrasound, and the fact that we're all carrying these multi-purpose high-tech devices around that are in constant communication with bigger, more powerful computers is opening up all kinds of diagnostic effects. There's a downside too. There's a lot of apps out there now where basically you can wire a doctor who's otherwise off duty 20 quid, 50 quid, whatever, to have a video call consultation. That strikes me as a bit exploitative, but I guess it's nice to have the option. It's just, that's another case of rich privilege. Right, Brexit stories. So, Super Saturday turned out not to be much. I'm still worried deeply that Boris is going to somehow force through some kind of terrible deal. His deal is worse than May's. May's deal, for all its flaws and problems, and the fact that it's a Brexit, which I don't want, maintained certain workers' rights protections and so on, which Bojo's version took the axe to. And in trying to rush it, there was no proper time for parliamentary scrutiny. Weirdly, I find myself cheering a Conservative again, in this case Letwin, who I don't have particularly fond memories of from his past involvement in government. But the Letwin Amendment basically guaranteed that Parliament gets a chance to properly scrutinise what's going on. Now what's going to happen? I don't know, right? Boris can't really bring his deal back again without any changes, though the Speaker might allow him to once more. Parliament might try and take control of proceedings again. We might see a vote of no confidence. We might see... Labour's moved. Corbyn has kind of subtly indicated that he's willing to back a second referendum without a general election first. And he's also indicated that he might be willing to step aside for the right person to be a prime minister in a government of national unity. So maybe his ego is finally going to let something happen here. But I don't know. The protests, which I wish I could have gone on this weekend, estimated about 2 million via usual tracking methods. At least 1 million people. Pro-Brexiters, barely a sausage, barely a chipolata, barely a toad in the hole. But, like I've said for quite some time now, years even, it's just too unpredictable. One positive effect of all this, silver linings and all, the whole Brexit process has sparked a huge boom in applications for politics courses at colleges and universities. So people subscribing to politics courses, which I did, has surged by about 28%. Now, virtually every time I get into a discussion about the EU or the UK Parliament, I find that the people arguing the opposite side have no real understanding of how either the UK or EU political systems work, why they work the way they do, what the historical context is. We basically don't have any civics lessons whatsoever. Some people don't even understand how first past the post a voting system works, even though they vote in it. People don't understand how their government works. They don't understand how the EU works, and a lot of people's hatred for one or the other comes from ignorance, which is to miss out entirely on this whole informed reasons to hate both political systems for various aspects that they get wrong. You know, I would rather be hateful and informed than ignorant and hateful, and I wish more people felt the same way. I wish there were more civics classes. I have kind of talked about how these things work and why they work the way they do, how they're meant to work, how they fail on the channel. Maybe I need to start giving proper civics courses on the channel. I don't know. I doubt it would be popular, but I'm glad that a lot more people are now interested in politics and political history and what ideologies actually are and how this all works. So there's a positive to Brexit. People are now interested in understanding politics. Now a negative. Years of austerity have forced a lot of people into food banks. At the same time as we've had austerity and more people have needed help, we've had the slow rollout of the universal credit system, which on paper is a good idea, in practice has been used to gouge the benefits and so on that a whole bunch of people have had. Schools also have long been underfunded and have long relied on parents and so on donating. But now we're seeing something going the other way. Primary schools are now giving away free food to hungry families. So stuff that's left over from school dinners or drives that they engage in to bring together food to give to poor families. So we're seeing the official food banks and so on being supplemented by schools offering food. There's often breakfast clubs at impoverished schools where kids can come in and get a bowl of cereal and some milk and something to drink, right? Remember, we used to get free milk in schools before Thatcher the milk snatcher. But a lot of families simply can't afford to feed themselves, their kids, anyone. And so schools are now becoming centres for food banks, which is a great sign of community coming together, but we're likely to see even more strain in the future. And it's not a bad thing that people are coming together around their schools and their pubs, and the village shop here does food packages. It's not a bad thing that this is happening. It's a bad thing that it's necessary, and it indicates a failure of our politics and our welfare system, that this is having to go on. So while I can applaud the initiative and the community spirit, I bemoan the fact that it's necessary. It's now 10 a.m. I checked these news stories at 9. Things may have changed already. That's how mad things are around Brexit. But number 10 is hoping to push for another vote on Boris's deal. Now, I strongly suggest that if you can find the time, you go and read it, and you also read May's deal, and you compare. There's a few analysts and people on Twitter who've already done this for you if you're feeling lazy, but Boris's deal is a lot worse for the common man, shall we say. Common man and woman, and all things in between. Because it no longer guarantees the sort of legal protections for workers' rights, individual rights, and so on that previously existed under the EU, and which May's deal, at least on paper, said were guaranteed and protected. That's gone, and that's a good indicator of where he's coming from and who is pulling his strings, or who stands to profit, right? You really need to examine the language. If you search around on Twitter, you'll find plenty. But this is a terrible deal, which is probably why he was trying to rush it. Worse than May's. And yet, something that bad is the only Brexit you're going to get. I think we'd be better off just withdrawing Article 50, saying, right, it's clear that we're not going to sort this out. We will revisit this in 5 years, which I think is the minimum amount of time before you can have a second exit vote. And then we can get a full, proper plan for the people who want Brexit. They can make the argument and find, feel out what an actual achievable deal is. And then we can revisit it and have another referendum. I'm hoping that in order to get his deal through, Boris is willing to attach a confirmatory referendum to it, or someone will amend to that effect, because I think that is the best way forward. Boris's deal versus Remain. I would have said no deal versus Remain. I still think he's angling for a no deal, but I'm willing to compromise and play politics on this. A second vote on Boris's deal depends on Bercow. The Speaker may not allow it. Now, there is the precedent that other additional votes were not allowed on May's deal. So there's a chance that Bercow will not allow another vote on the same deal unless there is some kind of significant change. A significant change could be an amendment to the bill to allow for a confirmatory referendum. Or significant enough changes in the text, which would require a new round of negotiations, and tick-tock, time is running down. I think the whole thing has underlined a huge amount of problems in our political system. I think we need to get it out of the way and address those issues. But I think the only reasonable way to get out of the way is to either cancel it or have a second ref that's legally binding and clean. Now, if the previous referendum had been legally binding, it would have been overturned in court. So there's that to consider. Making it binding does slave us to the public will, but it does also allow these kind of legal protections. Now, he was bound by law to send his letter to the EU asking for an extension. He sent a cut and paste note and didn't sign it, and sent a separate letter saying, no, we don't want an extension. Now, this is interesting because that sounds like he broke the law to a lot of QCs and constitutional legal scholars and so on. How do I explain why? He gave the appearance of complying with the Benn Act, but didn't really. It was like, we want an extension. Not really! So he obeyed the letter of the law, but there is a legal issue around frustrating the will of Parliament. So if you do something that frustrates the clear will of Parliament, which is that you genuinely ask for an extension in this instance, you may have broken the law. Now, courts are now being asked this to rule on it, whether Bojo broke the law by doing what he did, because it clearly frustrates the will of Parliament, which is obviously that they want an actual extension. So what's going to happen? I don't know. I mean, from my interpretation, and I'm no legal scholar, my interpretation is that he obviously flagrantly attempted to frustrate the will of Parliament, which is against the law, and so he should be prosecuted. And I don't know to what extent. I mean, sending him to prison, don't know, but he broke the law, so there should be some kind of punishment. He should be accountable, which takes us back to what we were saying earlier, right, about treating people equally before the law. So if Bojo breaks the law, he should be punished. If I break the law, I should be punished. That's equality, right? And it's probably absent, because even if he's found guilty, I doubt anything would particularly happen to him. But it's interesting, and it's actually going to court in Scotland, because they seem to be faster at dealing with these sorts of things, and slightly more sympathetic, I think. Whereas, well, not sympathetic. Another thing that's difficult to explain. The English courts very much like to stay aloof and distant from everything, which is why their previous ruling was so flabbergasting to a lot of people, because the High Court and the Supreme Court don't like to get dragged into politics. They don't like to make things that are seen as political decisions. And so they tend to default to the status quo, even when the status quo is legally wrong. The government of the day can usually rely on the High Court in particular, and the Supreme Court to almost the same extent, to just kind of stay hands off from everything and not get involved. But not the case. Scottish courts are a bit more willing to actually engage and enforce the law. So it's not sympathy, it's tradition, which runs so much of our government and isn't really very effective. So when it looked like Boris had a deal and no one had really had time to peruse it, the pound climbed slightly, right? When the Letwin Amendment passed, it went down again. Some people take this as being some kind of indictment against Remainers, but bear in mind, when the Brexit vote went through, the pound dropped really, really far and hasn't ever really recovered that much of what it lost. What it went up on was there was some chance of some kind of deal. It would soften things a bit, so a little bit of confidence returned to the pound, which then went away. But if a Brexit does occur, we're likely to see another slip. People say it's good for manufacturing, but we barely make anything anymore, right? And it makes things for everyone in the UK more expensive, relatively speaking, helps drive inflation, causes all kinds of other problems. So, historically, I think we've been better off when the pound has been worth more. Feel free to disagree, of course, but I don't think... Personally, I don't really think that the sort of little perturbations of the pound mean that much. But we did see a huge drop when all this happened, and I do think significant shifts are meaningful in the same way that hyperinflation and so on becomes meaningful. I think that's the indicator. The big swings, not the day-to-day little changes, are meaningful. Of course, depending on the state of the pound on the day, Brexiteers will argue either, oh, it's better when it's stronger, or it's better when it's weaker. But we don't really make anything anymore in any significant way. So, yeah, there you go. Right, let's see. Comments. Not a lot. People seem busy this morning. Not a lot of people around. Or I'm just boring. It has been it's been over an hour I've been wonking on, but there you go. I did miss last week. Good morning, Ben. Ben says he has very good compensation for work support calls where he works, to the point where he's happy if he ever gets called up. Yeah, I've had a few friends in tech support, which isn't necessarily the greatest paying profession in the world. Some of them used to be on call in case of server downs or whatever, and they got paid. It was more than 1.5. It may have been 2 or more times as much for hours done out of hours on weekends and so on. So, you know, they did pretty well out of it. I think all things considered, and they were reasonably happy when they got a call, unless it interrupted them right in the middle of something. Had a few role-playing games disrupted by people being on call and having to rush away to the office, which kind of spoiled the weekend for quite a few people. But it happens. But I'm glad you get compensation. A lot of people don't. There is an unwritten expectation at a lot of businesses that you're going to put in overtime for free, whether that's being on call, support, or whatever else, even if it's not in the contract, which is unfair. And people who don't put in those extra hours are less likely to get promotions and so on. It's a bit of a toxic work atmosphere. And yet at the same time we're being called lazy and shiftless by aspects of the Conservative Party who are now in the cabinet. Brits as a whole for not working so much. Europeans take it a lot easier than we do, and they're doing all right. So there you go. Ben also upbraids me for feeling sorry for the multi-billionaire. He's still a human being, barely, all appearances to the contrary. And while I can envy his wealth and so on, I do think it's isolating. And I do think early success can fuck you up really badly. Look at child stars, right? How many of them end up in a good place and on the straight and narrow when they get older, and he wasn't even really out of university when all this took off. I think that fucks you up. I think it distorts you. And I think when you're that wealthy, people act differently around you. And that's got to have an effect on people. And of course, people who are successful in business anyway are more likely to have psychopathic tendencies, which may just be worsened by a lack of equal human contact. So I can feel sorry for anyone, whether they're poor and homeless or multi-billionaires suffering from severe personality and socialization defects. But there you go. Right, I got stuff to be getting on with. I will keep you updated on what's going on. Remember, this is not my main channel, so please share it around. Encourage people to subscribe. This is where I put my live streams. If you want me to interview anyone about gaming or do Q&As or whatever, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I'm off. I have some monsters to write up and release, and various things to do, and a cat to look after. So, take care, everyone. Zang. Have a good one.